This is something that I think is very important to consider because it actually upsets me a little bit. And I don't mean that in a horrible way, but everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people say, oh, it's the first temple. It's the world's first temple. Well, first, as a geologist, I will say that how can you know anything is the first? Because you really can't, because that presupposes there's nothing before it. And I've seen too many times it's the first this or the first that. Then another one's found that's even older. But more importantly, I would not call it a temple. I think the best general term for it is university, that it is essentially the equivalent in ancient times of a university. And I want to elaborate on that because a university, I'm a university faculty member. I have been for since 1984. I have to think for a second, long time. Uh, and what do you have at a university? You have so many different things at a major university. You might have a quote temple. University I'm at, we have a chapel, a church type building that's non-denominational and it's religious, but for all religions, etc. So you have that type of thing. But at a university, you also have a museum often. You have a library. You have centers for learning. You may have a astronomical observatory. I think they were carrying out real science. And I think, among other things, when I study the site, they were looking at the sky. They were looking at the stars. And even more important, putting it into the context of what was happening at the end of the last ice age, I think they were studying the sun. They were studying nature. So Again, I come back to the concept of a university that, yes, there might be some religious aspects, some ritual aspects. Modern universities have plenty of ritual, believe me, and not just the ceremonies at the beginning and the end for graduation and that type of thing. But knowledge, a meeting place, essentially the equivalent of modern auditoriums, a place where people could exchange ideas, all these different aspects. Sometimes Katie, my wife, and I think of it as a university of the cosmos. And I think that really could sum it up very, very well. So to just call it a temple, I think that is not giving it full credit. And I don't mean to pick on the temple concept, but so many people have been calling it Göbeklitepe, the world's first temple. I've heard that so many times. No, I think it was much more than that. And again, I use the analogy of a university, but a place where you have learning, you have wisdom preserved. I'm sure they were teaching from one generation to the other. They were doing research, what I would consider scientific research. They probably had a historical branch of research too, because something that we find, and I mean that seriously, that with these very early civilizations, I think in many cases, and I see this even in Egypt, that they had a concept of history that was much broader than many people do today. Yes, of course, people like myself and my colleagues, we look at ancient history and we look at big picture, but the ancients, what we consider ancient people, they were doing the same thing and going back, and I believe looking for patterns, etc. So many different things going on, I believe, at Göbekli Tepe. And then this ties in with, we've only excavated maybe 5% of it. If Boston University, where I am a faculty member, were totally buried and covered over and excavated 12,000 years from now, and only 5% were excavated, and all that was excavated was one portion of the library versus someone else excavated only one portion of the gym, those would give two very, very different pictures. But in fact, they're both parts of a larger whole. So I think we have to keep this in mind also.